Hello. So this is Dr. Peters bringing you Humanity Over Hues. The last time that I put the podcast out there, that was me at the launch from back in October, and it was such a wonderful time to be with family and friends, and to be able to launch in the historic Harlem, New York. But this time around, we have a lovely, lovely guest that I've been able to become acquainted with over the last month or so. And I think you guys are going to be extremely intrigued and enlightened by what we talk about today. And so I'd like to introduce you all to Professor Donaire-Cirsovius. And she is coming from Lone Star College, North Harris in Texas. And so, without further ado, I want to turn it over to her. You guys know I don't like to talk too much. I'll ask my questions, and then I want the guest to take it away.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Peters, for having me on your podcast. Let me just tell you a little bit about my background for your listeners. I was born in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, which is a really, it's a mouthful, back in the 70s. So who's counting? And my family emigrated to the United States in 1989 to New Orleans. We had a connection in the city because my grandmother had been there for 30 plus years, and my mom was ready to be with her family at that point. So we moved to New Orleans and I did my education. My undergraduate degree is from the University of New Orleans. My master's degree is from the University of Louisiana Lafayette. And my doctoral work was done at Texas Christian University. Um, I was blessed in that my father's mother was a teacher, and she had a room in our house that was just for books. And so my very first memories of her was her teaching me to spell my name correctly before I went to kindergarten, being able to spell my name, being able to write my name by the time I got to kindergarten. I started to read very early uh, because I would experiment on my sister and the other children if I wasn't kept entertained. So my grandmother made sure that I started to read very early, and I have wonderful memories of her sets of encyclopedias. And so I was allowed to wander through her encyclopedia sets. And I had an aunt at that time who was in medical school, and she let me play with her medical books. And back then, for those of you who are too young to remember, they came with beautifully illustrated plates where you could go through and look at human anatomy. And so I was very blessed that I was surrounded by books and knowledge, and a father for whom the question, why does this happen or why does that happen? His answer was, go find out. And if I couldn't find it out in a book, I experimented until I could figure it out or not. And so I grew up in a household where knowledge was really all around me, and it was expected that we would pursue education not just for the idea of being able to take care of ourselves economically, but because knowledge was in and of itself a noble pursuit. And I feel sorry for my parents, all that money they spent on books, but I read all of them. I read each and every one of them. So that's who I am. I was once called the queen of the nerds, and that's true. I am. I am. Anything that has to, if it's a book, I'll read it.
I love it. I love it. So it's so funny. My next question for you was going to be, why you studied history, but I think you've kind of alluded to that already. And I mean, I think it's just fascinating that you grew up in a family that prioritized knowledge, that prioritize not just asking a question, but go do some work and actually figure out what that answer is. And if you still have some questions, then come back and talk to me, right? I think nowadays, as we look at our society, everything's right at the fingertips, right?
Mhm.
And you don't have to work too hard to go find what you think is the truth. Right? It depends on what platform you go to or whatever. It's not the Encyclopedia Britannica, right? That we all remember from, back in the day. So I just think that is fascinating. Now, one question that does come to mind to me is, though that is amazing, that you have parents and a grandmother that had a room just for books. What about our students and our kids out here that don't have that? How do you help them kind of garner that love for knowledge? Because we all know that it's needed, right?
It is. And sometimes I think as a society, it almost feels like we want to kill that natural inquisitiveness that children have, and the natural creativity. And so one of the first things I say to them on the first day of class is I quote Sesame Street, because I was lucky enough to grow up with two Sesame Streets, Spanish Sesame Street and English Sesame Street. I still like Big Bird better. And so and Oscar the Grouch is my favorite. But the one of the quotations from one of the founders of Sesame Street, which I quote at my students at the beginning of the semester, is those who read make the system, those who read make it in the system. And we sit down the very first day of class. I try to give some time to that quotation so that we can think about what that means. And we talk a lot at the beginning about why they are in my class, and what it is that they want to get out of it. And the most facile answer is usually, I want to get an A. And I'm like, yes, that's great. Okay, but beyond that, what is it that you want to achieve for yourself in this class? Of course, we all want to get good grades. And those good grades will come if you throw yourself into the work and you let the process happen. But I had a colleague many years ago talk about the fact that sometimes we as educators treat students as if they are empty vessels that are just waiting to be filled by us. But she used to talk about how they're not empty vessels, but they are little coffee cups that are turned over sometimes at the beginning of the semester. And you can't pour coffee into a turned over coffee cup. You've got to turn that coffee cup over. And so that quotation for me, and sitting around and talking about what that quotation means and what it means for them, is one of the ways that I start that process of trying to get them interested in being owners of their own learning. And I also try to create classes and spaces where my voice is not the most important voice. I assign a lot of reading, but we also do a lot of discussion. The longer I have taught, and I'm going to say I'm going on 20 years of teaching, the longer I have taught, the further away I get from straight lecture, just talking at students, that sage on the stage thing. I want to hear what they have to say. I know what I know about what we're talking about, but their insights, their thoughts, their feelings, the way that they're processing this, the metacognition that they're going through, is really important to me. And one of my biggest successes when a student has absolutely nothing for the first 6 weeks, but then by the time we get to mid-semester, they're in the middle of the conversation all the time, and they're starting to contribute. And then the best thing they can do for me is they'll come back for another class, and then they're good at this already, and then they'll help me do that turning over of the coffee cup for other students. But the other thing is, I will buy, if a student even looks at me a little sideways, and asks me a question, I will offer them a book, and I will purchase that book for them, because I think that the physical books are so important. And it's one of the things that I try to do with colleagues at work, at our campus. We have these discussion sessions we call the Big Ideas Crew, where we buy students books, where we then have that space for them to discuss. Because I think that building up their own personal libraries, even if it's just one or two books a semester at a time, is an incredibly powerful thing. And I find I've had students come back to me years later and show me that they're still keeping that first book they got from me, or that first book that we had in our discussion group, and that it means something to them.
Again, amazing. So what you just talked about there is how you are a selfless, and I'm going to say it in my terms, right? So I'm active duty military, and that's leadership, right? Selfless leadership. and also that care and that empathy for your students, which we know in our education system nowadays you don't always get that love and that care, and especially when students get to college, the check has already been paid, right? Like, so bottom line is, what you get out of this class is what you put into it. But what I'm hearing is that this is a give and take where you and your students are working together for the good of them to increase their knowledge and their thirst to keep moving forward and learning more. That's just simply amazing, because we don't find that all the time. Thank you.
Well, it's actually it's they give me so much. I can be tired, I can have a headache, I could have had a bad day, I could have had a bad meeting. But and people always make fun of me because the moment I step into the classroom and I'm with students, everything goes away. It doesn't matter. Everything goes away. And in, I am one of those people who sort of stumbled into their job, but it's not really a job. It's not it's I don't drive to work with dread. you know I get to work and I get to do these things, and that's what I want to instill in them as well. It's, hey, it's not you have to come to class, you get to come to class, you get to come hang out with us, and we get to explore things together. And that is just, it's a blessing. It's really a blessing, and they keep me on my toes, and I learn from them. And I think a lot. I never teach even if it's the same subject, I never teach the same class the same way, because each class has its own personality, and I learn so much from them, and we adjust as we go. So I have a plan of what I want them to learn. It's mostly in my head, but how we get there doesn't matter to me as long as we get there and it's good and enjoyable and valuable for them.
Where passion meets purpose, that's where joy lies,
Yes, yes,
right?
ma'am.
That's what you just described to me. Okay, so you know what? I want to keep going with this conversation, but specifically getting to the space where, yep, we know that you're a professor, but you chose to be a professor at a certain type of college. And when we spoke previously, you said something to this effect: raise standards as high as you can, and the kids will raise the bar or they will meet it.
Yep. So
So
I
if you can dive into that, yeah.
so when I was in my doctoral program, everybody that's gone through graduate school or a PhD can remember those times when you were hungry and you had not eaten and you needed to find a little extra money. So I started adjuncting at Tarrant County College in Fort Worth, and um, I fell in love with the community college. I fell in love with the vision of the community college, the mission of the community college. I fell in love with the students, the whole thing. So for me, community college, even some people in my life were not happy. They expected me to go into a university setting and to do research and write. But I honestly think that sometimes some of us are born to be professors and teachers, and I was born for that. And I fell in love with the community college for a host of different reasons. I just had a conversation with my students that really encapsulated it for me. They were saying that community college, and this is from them, community college sometimes is where you end up if you're poor, or if you couldn't get into university, or if you're perceived as not very smart. And that's not how I see it. Community colleges, we take the top 100%. We meet our students exactly where they are, and we work with them so that their dreams and their aspirations come true. And in the 20 years that I've been doing this, that has never been even a question for me. I wanted to be in community college, and that's where I'm going to be, and that's where my career is going to be for the rest of my life. My kids and my students deserve the best, and they deserve care, they deserve compassion, and they deserve for me to meet them where they are, and figure out by talking to them where it is that they want to be. And it's my job to figure out how we get them there. And I'm always going to be grateful for having been hungry that time in Fort Worth, because I come from, I hadn't occurred to me that community college might be for me, for my career. But it was one of those wonderful accidents in your life where you try something and it works out so well, and it really gives you a purpose. My students give me purpose.
That's great. So, what do you tell your students or even maybe not your direct student, if they have an interest in studying history and potentially taking the path or a similar path as you, like how do you advise them?
So I always say to my students who want to study history that it's a wonderful major. It's a wonderful choice. History prepares you for a whole host of things. So if you don't want to come in and take my job when I retire, that's fine. But history makes you think, read, write, research critically. One of my favorite economic historians is Galbraith, James K. Galbraith, and one of his quotes is that every 20 years, new suckers are born, right? Because humans, we tend to forget the past. And it's not and it's not that the past repeats itself per se. It's just that humans react to similar stimuli in similar ways. But if we can think critically of why it is that people in the past did things the way that they did, it informs the way that we can think about what is in the present. And so I think getting a bachelor's degree in history opens up a whole host of other opportunities for you. You don't have to go into teaching, but you can go into the archive. You can go to law school. You can even go to medical school now, right? I know that a lot of people think that to go to medical school, you have to have a biology degree, but many programs are looking for people who are steeped in the liberal arts. And then that's the thing. Part of it is I think of history as one of the supreme liberal arts, and liberal arts are just the education of a free people. And everybody deserves to have the education that is given to all free peoples, because that is your cultural and your cultural patrimony. It belongs to you. And so I'm always excited to welcome a budding historian. And as a matter of fact, I treat all of my students, whether history majors or not, as apprentice historians. And we do apprentice historian things in class because I want them to get a little taste of that. But I would encourage them to think about, even, if you don't want to major in history, think about a history minor, because it is in those classes that you learn to think, you learn to read, you learn to write, and you might discover exactly who you are through that.
Great answer. And I'm going to keep pulling that thread. So, what you mentioned was that history informs the present. And I
Yes,
actually just
ma'am.
had a conversation with a young 12-year-old, 12 or 14-year-old today is one of my soldiers' kids. And we were talking about history, and he says that he loves history. But what that made me think about is we are currently going through a transition of power. Obviously, the transition has already happened, but there's a lot of changes. So, a lot of transitions that are happening in the federal government, transitions in the state government, and you name it, just all over the place. And so, as we think about history, how have you at least seen the impacts of this transition on your college as well as potentially on your students? And are there any, I guess, semblance of what we've seen in the past or anything like that that has turned into maybe a conversation in your school or some type of dialogue? So I'll just kind of leave that huge question out there for you to kind of talk us through that.
So I can't speak for the college as a whole, but I could talk about what some of my students are saying about what is going on. They are paying attention. They are concerned about the transition of power that is happening. And what I try to do for them when they express their concerns is to put it in a in a very long duration of time, just so that we can tease out the threads of how we got here. One of the things that I want them to understand is why we are here, how we got here, and to think about other times and places in the world where you've had difficult transition moments, but people have endured. And maybe this looks this for them they're a young generation. They are beset by so many things that they worry about. They worry about the changing climate. They worry about violence because they are the first generation to grow up with the idea of a drill for a shooting incident in their schools. They are worried about AI taking their place. They have so many different pressures that we did not have. And one of the things that we talk about is, yes, there are these periods in history that are marked by tremendous change. And I am sure that the people who lived through those times thought, oh my God, the world is ending. And what they meant was this transition is so difficult and so far removed from everything we know. How can we endure? How can we bring about new social structures or new ways of thinking of family or new ways of thinking about relationships or new ways of thinking about how we sustain ourselves at work or just mentally and emotionally. And so I try to talk to them about those times. My favorite time to talk about with them right now is the late 19th century, because I think that the 19th century really is, especially the late 19th century, the last 20 to 30 years of it, is that formational, foundational period of time that we don't talk about enough. And really is the time that makes this modern world, this contemporary world that we live in. And in some ways, we some people, which is it happens in every time period, are seeking to take us back there, not necessarily always in a good way, right? And so the better we understand that, and the better we understand the solutions that the problems that arose from that, and the solutions that our forebears came up with, the better we will be able to face that. And so we've had a lot of discussions about the late 19th century. We've had a lot of discussions about what it all means and what it is that they can do so that they will be prepared to be the young leaders we need to take over from this time and build anew and reinvent society in a way that works for them.
Are there any specific things within the late 19th century that you guys kind of lean into? Um, and we can go as far with this as you want, but I'm sure there's some specific topics as it relates to the late 19th century that probably comes to mind for a lot of them, especially in your class.
So the latest one to arise is the idea of a world of empires, right? So they're concerned with the Russian incursion into Ukraine. They're concerned with the problems in Israel and the Palestinian territories. They are concerned when they hear our president speak about Greenland and taking Canada as the 51st state. And so we've been talking a lot about the world order that arose out of 1945 and how international law, really the idea of a balance in the world, international law, it's very much a mid 20th century um, idea. And the 19th century is a lot more disorganized, for lack of a better word. It's a lot more disorganized. Is a period of empires, of competitive empires that eventually drew us into two horrific world wars. And so we're trying to think and talk about how we do not repeat those mistakes. How do we not get ourselves into positions um, as individuals and as state, nation state, that ends up in those terrible um, in that terrible problem of a world war. And so that this week has been we've been very busily deconstructing empire in class and what it might mean for our time period and what it means for foreign relations for foreign relations around the world to revert to a 19th century way of thinking instead of a 20th century way of thinking, even though they do call the 20th century the 1900s, and it makes me feel so old.
So that's scary, right? Like to think about that because you're absolutely right. The 19th century brought us into this landscape where now we're fighting world wars. And so to even think that that may be where we're going again, like, oh my goodness. And so I guess, where I want to take this, because I don't want this to be doom and gloom, right? Because I truly believe in my heart that transitions, no matter who's in power, no matter who who has the influence or whatever, it is an opportunity, right?
Mhm.
So how are we using, and specifically you and your college, right? And no, I'm not asking you to speak for your college, but I know there's some great things that you're doing. So how are you using this time frame as an opportunity?
So, and I'm going to make a historical allusion. The Spanish flu pandemic of at the end of World War One changed that society, and I do think that COVID is also changing. Coming out of the COVID pandemic is changing our society, and some changes are for good, like vinyl tile to make your house much cleaner and easier to clean and keep spick and span. But also coming out of COVID, we had, I think, some of those human connections broke down, right? And I think that COVID got that breakdown of human connections through in COVID was accelerated by the fact that we all carry these really potent computers in our pocket, and it's really easy to go an entire day without looking at another real human being, and yet still feel you're getting interaction through the screen. So one of the things that I'm doing, and I'm doing this with a wonderful group of faculty who have committed to doing the very best we can by our students. We are founding something that we're calling the Community Study Center, and that is part of our way of actually reestablishing those bonds and those human links with each other, and giving students a place on campus where they can just be. And what I mean by that is that they can, you speak to our students, and one of them remarked that it is very easy when you are a community college student to drive in, take your class, and then if you have a break of a couple of hours, you go home. And then you come back for your other class, and then you drive away. And that's not the experience, I think, that is most optimal for our students. And I don't think that's the experience our students want. And we wanted to have this place on campus where if you have an hour gap or 2 hour gap, you can come in, you can sit down, you can pick up book out of the bookshelves. Maybe a professor or two are hanging out in there. You can have a conversation with a professor who may not be your professor in that semester, but maybe an interesting guy. Maybe you want to talk economics. Maybe you want to talk government. Maybe you want to talk biology. Who knows what you might want to talk about? And it might even send you down a path that you've never thought about for yourself. But it's also for other students to talk to each other and just be. And we know that when you build community, when you know that you fit in, that you have a group of your people, right, you're going to be more successful. So this is intended for them to feel connected to each other, to us, and for us to feel connected to them, and for them to be connected to the community in which our institution, which is the higher learning institute, the institution of higher learning for our area of Houston, for all of that to come closer together, because some of those bonds frayed. And I think this is such a wonderful opportunity. And I just think, when we have a student advisory board, and I met with them this week, and they're so excited about this idea. And what it makes me so happy about their excitement is because they see themselves leaving some sort of legacy for students that come after them. And that just, the fact that they have this goodness in them, and this desire to do something for their fellow students, for their peers, some of whom they'll never meet, that just speaks volumes of who they are.
Hmm. Go figure. A community college that is a community,
Yeah.
right? Like, That is amazing. And I am so thankful that you and the other faculty members, as well as the students that are giving their time and their efforts, right, to make this come to pass. That's wonderful. And I can't wait to hear about, how well it's going and what other wonderful things are birthed from this interaction of interconnectivity, right? Like so much happens when you bring people together that have that passion, that have that desire. So I can't wait. Can't wait. We're getting down to the end of our podcast. And so people kind of bounce in and out of podcasts sometimes and or unless they're driving like usually I do, and I just throw it on and I'm listening to it for however long I'm on the road. But I always want to kind of end the podcast with, if there's nothing else that a person takes away from our talk, what do you want to leave them? What is that? I don't know, that epiphany and or special advice or whatnot that you would want to leave with our listeners?
I would say, again, as a historian, I think of you in long duration, and life is always difficult in one way or the other. But if you wake up every day and you think to yourself, what is the most good I can do for the most people today? Right. And you leave you and you set that bar high. What is the most good I'm going to do for the most people today? And at the end of the day, you can say, wow, I did this one good thing. Maybe it wasn't every good thing that you wanted to do, but you did one good thing for another human being. You helped a student re-enroll in a class, or you helped them figure out how to pay for their textbooks, or whatever it was, a small act of service or kindness that you did for that person, then we are all making our world better. But that only happens if you're willing to do that face-to-face connection. So don't always be looking at your screen. Sometimes look up and see what kind of good you can do for somebody else.
So look, you just hit the nail on the head with what Espresso Unicorn is, right? We believe in the human connective collective effort, right? So that's all of us coming together and love in motion. When we come together and decide that we are going to support our fellow man, there is nothing that we cannot do. And so I appreciate you being on with us today on Humanity Over Hues. You can find us on Spotify. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and all of the regular areas, right, that you can find podcasts. But those are the two major ones. And we just appreciate you sharing your knowledge, for loving people, for loving your students and loving history and being willing to share it with us. Thank you so much from myself as well as everybody at Espresso Unicorn.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure. It's wonderful to have people like you doing that thing that connects humanity with each other. Thank you again.
You're so welcome.